So, you want to hear something crazy? The year is 1950. A young Cuban man has just graduated from the University of Havana with a degree in law. The student had spent a lot of time in his college years participating in resistance movements in Colombia and the Dominican Republic, eventually causing him to go into hiding for several weeks before returning to complete his degree. Now, ready to enter the world of Cuban politics, he began preparing to run for parliament, specifically hoping to get elected in 1952. Alas, these elections would be cancelled as Fulgencio Batista, one of the three presidential candidates, staged a coup using military power. His control over the island would last for 7 years, and in those years they would see Cuba be even more overcome by crime, hedonism, political corruption, as well as being taken advantage of by US capitalists, helping push forward a resentment of the US by the Cuban people. This would all change on New Year's Eve 1958 when Batista informed his cabinet that he would be resigning and fleeing the country. The past 7 years were full of rebellion against his leadership, seeing things like daily student protests and attacks on government buildings such as the failed attack on the Moncada barracks in Santiago. This attack was made by a vanguard group called El Movimiento 26 de Julio, or the 26th of July movement. They would go on to become Cuba's sole political party, and at its head was the same graduate of the University of Havana from earlier, Fidel Castro. To sum up Castro's entire leadership into a few words would be impossible. There were some pros, many cons, and a split between those who loved him and those who hated him. As a professed Marxist, seemingly leaning towards a Leninist ideology, he quickly aligned Cuba with the ideas of places like Russia over the US. However, where he may have excelled in social improvement, his regime failed to improve the economic or political situations in the country, becoming notorious for experiencing periods of economic depression and seriously mistreating and often killing any who would oppose him. He is known for two major events in American history: the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Cuban Missile Crisis. So you may be asking yourself, Six, why are you giving me all this information on Castro? I just want to hear about how the guy almost died a bunch. Well, my fellow viewer, I feel like it's important to explain why so many people wanted this guy dead. The government before him was terrible, but they let America conduct business. Simply put, they hated Castro because he wouldn't play ball. And he was also a communist in the 1900s, which was the biggest no-no. They say that Castro survived 368 assassination attempts by the CIA alone. And although it's kind of understood that that number might be a little exaggerated, it's still insane that he survived more than 2. Also, if you're gonna watch any part of this video, please make sure you watch the last one. Skip to it if you want. I'll put a time down here. It is the most insane thing I've ever heard in my life, and I love it to death. Please, I beg you, if you're gonna watch any, watch that one. Now that the lengthy history lesson is over, let's get into the video. But just remember, whether you love or hate Castro, the man knew how to survive. It's no secret that the mob had a lot of capital invested in Cuba, specifically Havana, before Castro came to power. Between Cuba and Miami, the mafia made millions both legally and, more commonly, illegally. Castro saw the mob as partners with the US government and the US corporations in the exploitation of Cuba and its people, kicking them out and killing the profits from the clubs and hotels they had put so much money into. Knowing this, it's no surprise that they were willing to cooperate with the federal government in the removal of Castro from his position. In September 1960, Sam Giancana and Johnny Roselli entered the picture. Now see, these guys weren't just two random street soldiers, they were big names. Giancana was the leader of the Chicago Outfit, the same organization that Al Capone led in the 1920s, and Roselli, nicknamed Handsome Johnny, was the overseer of numerous mafia casinos in Las Vegas. They were approached in the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami by a man named Robert Mayhew, a cutout, or middleman, for the CIA, acting as a method of plausible deniability. He offered the two a $150,000 killing fee, bounty, it was a damn bounty, for Fidel Castro's life, equivalent to over $1.6 million in today's money. These two total red-blooded Americans then agreed to do it free of charge, although it is generally believed that the two mobsters thought that doing this for the CIA would earn them a get-out-of-jail-free card, and for a few years it did. So now it's 1961. The two parties have been working together for a little bit, and the wise guys have set up a contact that they only refer to as Joe that could operate as a courier between the US and Cuba. It's actually really cool reading these old declassified files because you see memos in the files that explain certain things, such as Sam Giancana having the codename Sam Gold, but we also see things that the agency only learned after the fact. For example, the file says Mayhew phoned O'Connell, another guy working the case, one Sunday morning and called his attention to the parade supplement in one of that morning's Miami newspapers. It carried an article on the Cosa Nostra, with pictures of prominent members. The man Mayhew and O'Connell knew as Sam Gold appeared as Mom Salvatore Sam Giancana, a Chicago-based gangster. Joe the courier, who was never identified to either Mayhew or O'Connell in any other way, turned out to be Santos Travacante, the Cosa Nostra chieftain in Cuba. For those of you who don't know, Cosa Nostra was the name for the Sicilian Mafia as well as the Italian Mafia in the States and related areas, meaning our thing in Italian. Anyways, 1961, these guys have been working together for a little bit. Very quickly, the operation was almost completely shut down due to the love triangle incident. Cliff notes, the CIA agreed to illegally wiretap comedian Dan Rowan's hotel room in Las Vegas, who Sam Giancana believed was in a romantic relationship with his girlfriend. It got out, the FBI wanted to pursue charges against the CIA agents and the mobsters involved. It was eventually shut down because they wanted the guys to, kill Castro, yada yada. It's believed that the mobsters also had a hand in deciding how to take Castro out, claiming that poison pills were more reliable than guns. The CIA then tested their poison pills by dissolving them in water and administering them to guinea pigs. Not like human test subjects, like actual guinea pigs. What's funny is that the results of the test found that the pills were ineffective, but 3 pills were still given to Roselli anyways. In early 1961, Roselli handed the pills off to Traficante, who then passed them to Juan Orta in Cuba. At one time, Orta was Castro's office chief and director general of the office of the Prime Minister. Going on to say, Orta had once been in a position to receive kickbacks from the gambling interests, had since lost that source of income and needed the money. However, shortly before receiving the pills, Orta had lost his position in the Prime Minister's office, while planning for the operation was still happening. The files simply say that Orta is understood to have kept the pills for a couple weeks before returning them. According to the gangsters, Orta got cold feet. What we see later in the files, however, tells a different story. It goes on to say, it appears Edwards and O'Connell did not know at the time of Orta's fall from favor. It would seem, though, that the gangsters did know that Orta had already lost his access to Castro. It seems likely that while the agency thought the gangsters had a man in Cuba with easy access to Castro, what they actually had was a man disgruntled at having lost access. Not very surprising, knowing the guys who hate the federal government tried to pull a fast one on him. A number of other poisoning attempts occurred after this, none of them working, usually ending in the operatives imprisoned or executed by firing squad. The last poisoning attempt took place at one of Castro's favorite restaurants, but as soon as the pills were delivered at the restaurant, Castro stopped visiting it altogether. The report says, our belief is that Castro was extremely well informed on what was going on. As time passed, Lyndon B. Johnson ordered the CIA to stop their cloak and dagger tactics, and the mob fled the country. Fidel Castro had a huge love of diving, and 2 assassination attempts worked on this information. The first of which included a large seashell, most likely a conch of some kind. Conch, right? It's conch. Although this plan was never carried out, it is talked about in minor detail in the JFK files. Basically, in 1963, the CIA brainstormed a way to hit Castro with a big boom. They spoke of preparing a booby-trapped spectacular seashell which would be submerged in an area where Castro often skin dived. Their plan was to pick or paint a shell that would entice Castro to pick it up, triggering on impact. After some deliberation, they determined there was no shell in the Caribbean that was large enough to hold a sufficient amount of explosive which was attractive enough to attract the attention of Castro. Other problems arose with the potential of someone other than Castro picking it up, as well as placing it somewhere that Castro just wouldn't dive in time. On top of these, the report says a midget submarine which was anticipated to be used for the emplacement of the seashell did not have a long enough operating range. A long shot idea that would have probably never worked, but can you imagine if Fidel Castro died via seashell? Oh my gosh, dude. Shortly after discussing how to ocean frack Castro to death, the CIA hatched another plot. Attorney James Donovan had personal access to Castro at the time as he was heading to Cuba to negotiate with the leader on the release of U.S. citizens in Cuban jails. Hey, editing 6 is here. That was partially wrong. They were from Brigade 2506, which was the group of Cuban exiles that were sent to Cuba that were slaughtered in the Bay of Pigs. The ones who were captured instead of killed were the ones he was trying to release. I knew that, wrote it wrong when I wrote the script, completely on me. But yeah, James Donovan was a freaking beast, dude. Anyways, back to the video. According to the book, That Infernal Little Cuban Republic, the United States and the Cuban Revolution by Lars Schultz. Damn, try saying that 5 times fast. Schultz says James Donovan would give the Cuban leader a contaminated skin diving suit. Technical services swapped a snorkel with a tuberculosis bacillus and dusted the suit with a debilitating fungus, Madura foot, which sometimes requires amputation. Donovan, however, was not open to the idea and decided to give Castro a different diving suit. The contaminated suit never even left the lab. Later on, Richard Helms, who would become the director of the CIA in 1966, would go on to say the plan was cockeyed from the start. In 1993, Vanity Fair published a tell-all article interviewing Marita Lorenz, one of Castro's lovers, baby mama, and a CIA informant. Her story takes place in 1959 as a cruise ship called the Berlin anchored in Havana Harbor. She told Vanity Fair, "I was standing on the bridge and in the distance I could see this launch coming towards us. It was filled with around 27 men, all with the same beard. One was taller than the others. He was standing on the bow and he had a rifle. She goes on to say, I screamed out to them in German. The tall one yelled out, I want to come aboard. I asked who he was, and he started laughing and flashing a lot of teeth. Yo soy Cuba, he said, Comandante Fidel Castro. Here we get a glimpse into two things that garnered Castro's support at the time, his confidence and his charisma. Castro would take Cuba only 2 months after this, and Lorenz goes on to say just one of the craziest things I've ever heard. I reminded him that this is German soil, referring to the ship. Fidel said yes, but you are in my harbor. A good-looking man pushed forward and introduced him as Che Guevara. I want a German beer, he said. In one meeting, Merida had not only met the future leader of Cuba, but also one of the most notorious guerrilla commanders in the world, to this day. And I cannot blame Che for taking his opportunity to try some German beer, because it's just, oh my gosh, it's just so good. Anyway, she goes on to say that she was instantly mesmerized by Castro, talking about how their first meeting they had beer and sloppy joes, and just talks about how charismatic he was. He kissed her later. That night they had dinner with her father, and then the ship returned to New York, leaving her hopelessly in love. A few days later, Fidel sent a private plane to New York to bring her back, and for the next 7 months she lived with him in the Habana Libre Hotel. In this time, she learned Spanish, met and even befriended Castro's longtime companion Celia Sanchez, and quote, suffered through his flings with other girlfriends. In 1959, after a failed attempt for Fidel to meet with President Eisenhower, Lorenz learned that she was pregnant, leading to the U.S. State Department referring to her as the First Lady of Cuba. Later that year, we start to see the conflict in her life begin. In May, Lorenz met Frank Sturgis, a mercenary and one of the future Watergate burglars. Sturgis originally did odd jobs for the Batista regime, but found no issue proving his skills to Castro, quickly building a rapport. Before long, he was awarded the operation of casinos and the title of Chief of Air Force Intelligence. Very early into Fidel's reign, it became pretty apparent that building a relationship with the US would not be easy, and Lorenz could tell that Sturgis would switch teams again. She's quoted saying, he's always been a soldier of fortune, or misfortune. Sturgis can also be quoted in the article saying, I was a double agent. I was recruited by the CIA in 1958 and stayed in Havana until June 30th, 1959. Sturgis would later admit to asking her to poison Castro, but she refused because, quote, she was in love with the son of a bitch. In October 1959, a tragic tale would occur to her. 7 months pregnant with Castro's child, she was slipped a drug in her drink at the time, thinking maybe it was meant for Castro. They quickly took her to a hospital where she was assured that her and her baby were fine before being injected with something and returned to her home in the Habana Hilton. When she woke up, she found people packing her bags, prepping for her return to the United States. Later in life, she admitted that upon returning, she was admitted to Roosevelt Hospital, where she was being treated for a botched abortion. Fidel was not around for any of this. This was the turning point for Lorenz. It's speculated that Lorenz went through a second abortion in 1959 as well, and Castro would go on record saying he had no involvement with any of the pregnancies she had. For weeks after her return, her mother, Sturgis, and a CIA operative named Alexander Rourke Jr. questioned her non-stop about her involvement in Cuba. Before long, Merida was full-on working as an informant for the FBI, infiltrating the New York chapter of the 26th of July movement, later stating that she became a contract agent for the CIA. Her first assignment for the CIA was the big one: assassinate Fidel Castro. She trained in Miami, and later that year she would return to Havana for a dry run, testing the waters to see if Castro would be okay with her presence. It was alright, and a few weeks later she returned to carry out the actual assassination. She was given 2 botulism and toxin pills, with just one having the power to kill Castro in the matter of seconds. She goes on to say, I knew the minute I saw the outline of Havana I couldn't do it. Quickly going to her hotel room and stashing the poison in a jar of cream. It dissolved and the plan was botched. Shortly after, Castro entered the room and asked her, are you running around with those counter-revolutionaries in Miami? She said yes, and then he laid down asking, did you come here to kill me? She replied, yes, I wanted to see you. He goes on to hand her his pistols, saying that no one can kill him, a gut feeling that was seemingly correct in hindsight. Then, in pure James Bond fashion, they made love and he left the room. She returned to Miami, and a few months later, the Bay of Pigs invasion occurred. Merida would go on to do other operations for the CIA, and Castro will live on for decades after. The cigar plot is quite possibly the most infamous assassination plan the CIA ever hatched regarding Castro. On the 16th of August, 1960, Dr. Edward Gunn, chief of the CIA's Operations Division, wrote a memo talking to what we can assume to be his division. It states on the 16th of August, 1960, he received a box of Cuban cigars to be treated with a lethal material. He understood them to be Castro's favorite brand. It goes on to say that within the next month, Gunn contacted an agent of the Technical Services Division, whose name was redacted, giving them the box of cigars. It then says he did contaminate a full box of 50 cigars with with botulinum toxin, a virulent poison, which would kill the intended victim upon merely putting it in the mouth. The box was delivered on February 13th, 1961, but they were never told who collected the box. It's safe to assume the box never made it to Castro. There was also talk of an explosive cigar being considered to take him out, however this has been theorized to be a myth or at least a joke by the CIA. In November 1967, the Saturday Evening Post published an article claiming that during a United Nations visit by Castro the year prior, a CIA operative came to the NYPD Chief Inspector Michael J. Murphy with a plot to have him light up an explosive cigar. Whether it was real or not did not stop the media from having a field day with the story, appearing on a cover of Mad Magazine as well as the poster for the documentary 638 Ways to Kill Castro. You know what they say, kids, smoking kills. This one also has a very James Bond vibe. So here's the deal. You have this high-ranking official in Cuba that's in communication with the US of A. He wants to help bring down Castro and is convinced he can do it. He goes on record saying he wanted to get the internal revolt, a coup, underway. So what does he do? He asks for some spy gear, specifically a pellet pen, something he can carry into a meeting with Castro without suspicion and shoot him dead in his chair. The files we have that talk about this say it was never made. However, the agency did develop a ballpoint pen which has a hypodermic needle inside that when you pushed a lever, the needle came out and poison could be injected into someone. Pretty freaking cool, but when it was brought to the contact in Paris, he declined the tool and stopped the attempt. The file states the Cuban contact declined the gadget because of the close proximity of which he would have to get to a person if anything developed in the form of a confrontation with him. In the end, the guy asked for some weapons to try to pull it off, and the case officer told him they'd deliver some to Cuba. The interesting point in this is that this assassination attempt in Paris was supposed to take place on November 22nd, 1963. Some of you just had your eyebrows raised, while the rest of you are wondering what's so important about that date. Well, my friends, on November 22nd, 1963, on Elm Street in Dallas, Texas, the 35th President of the United States, John F. Kennedy, was shot. For decades, there have been numerous people who believe that the CIA killed Kennedy. The JFK files, although never explicitly saying they killed him, because, let's be honest, there's no way in hell they'd allow a file like that to get out no matter what the president says, they do allude to a couple very interesting things that could be considered proof in some eyes that they did indeed take him out, or were at least a part of it. Wendigoon just recently uploaded a video going over thousands of pages regarding this. Highly recommend you check it out if that stuff interests you. The reason I bring this up is mainly just to point out how interesting this happenstance is. It's no secret that JFK opposed Castro. The US disliked a communist nation so close to their shores, and although JFK's cabinet inherited the plan from the Eisenhower administration, Kennedy was the one who greenlit the Bay of Pigs invasion. Hell, JFK was the one who authorized Operation Mongoose, a plan literally dedicated to destabilizing and overthrowing the Cuban government, the very operation that most of these assassination attempts come from. Operating under the assumption that the CIA had a hand in JFK's death, I think it's a very interesting thing to think about what their plan was for that day. Taking out both Castro and Kennedy would make waves in the political sphere. Maybe they thought the death of Kennedy would take the heat off of the US from Russia following Castro's death. Maybe they wanted a full stop to the Cuban conflict. Who knows? We've entered conspiracy theory territory now, so I'm gonna move on before I step on more toes and end up face down in a river somewhere. Anyways, next topic. This one is short and sweet, and also not an actual attempt on Castro's life, more his image. In 1960, the CIA tossed around the idea of sprinkling thallium powder into Castro's shoes while he was on a trip outside of Cuba, anticipating he'd put them on at some point at night to have them shined. They tested the dust in hopes that it would work, in hopes that the powder would be absorbed into his skin, causing his beard to fall out, and thereby destroying Castro's image. It never went through, at least to our knowledge, and Castro kept that damn beard until the day he died. You remember those wacky, zany little mob guys that we talked about in the first point? Well, their operation with the poison stuff was pretty lackluster, but the attempt that got the closest gets its own point in this video because I personally just kind of find it funny. Here's a fun fact about Castro. The dude loved ice cream. The ate it daily kind of love. The conclude a large lunch by eating 18 scoops kind of love. So the CIA worked with that, and honestly got pretty damn close to taking the feller out. In March 1963, a botulinum toxin pill was delivered to the Havana Libre Hotel, Castro's headquarters at the time. They hid the pill in a freezer located in the hotel's cafeteria. Everything went as smooth as it could. It was the perfect setup to take the man out once and for all. All they had to do was take the pill from the freezer and put it in Castro's nightly chocolate milkshake. That night, the time finally came for the act. The operative opened the freezer, milkshake in hand, and the pill was frozen to the shelf! They tried to get it out, eventually using all their might and breaking the pill, spilling it onto the floor. According to the same article that covered Marita Lorenz's interview, Castro himself knew of this attempt, calling it the most successful assassination attempt on his life. Okay, so I originally read this from a Reddit post and prayed to God Almighty that it was real, but kept coming up relatively short on proof. I found numerous articles that spoke of it, but never actual any files or texts confirming it was true. That was, until I found this article on nowiknow.com that gave an actual link to the original text. It wasn't revealed in the JFK files. It was a paper put together by a Senate subcommittee in 1975 titled Alleged Assassination Plots Involving Foreign Leaders. So, during Operation Mongoose, many people came up with ideas that we've seen in this video, but the craziest one and my all-time personal favorite thing to come out of my government period was the idea thought up by Brigadier General Edward Lansdale, that beautiful, freaking insane human being. The way I imagine the conversation going is Lansdale saying, instead of taking Castro's life, what if we just convince Cuba to overthrow him? To which everybody around him was like, yeah, Ed, that's what we're discussing. And then he goes, no, we convinced them to overthrow him by convincing the primarily Catholic nation of Cuba that Fidel Castro is actually the Antichrist, and that the only way to allow the second coming of Jesus Herald Christ, our Lord and Savior, is to remove him from power. To quote the interview, this plan of spreading the word that the second coming of Christ was imminent and that Christ was against Castro, who was Antichrist. And you would spread the word around Cuba, and then on whatever date it was, there would be a manifestation of this thing. And at the time, just over the horizon, there would be an American submarine that would surface just off of Cuba and send up some star shells. And this would be the manifestation of the second coming, and Castro would be overthrown. Get this, they called it elimination by illumination. So, star shells are projectiles you shoot up into the sky and they burn bright. It's like that one mission in the Modern Warfare reboot where they shoot the light mortars up so you can see in the dark. But wait, there's more. According to another rendition of the plan, they wanted to fly American planes above the clouds coordinating with the star shells. The planes would then broadcast the voice of Jesus Christ telling the Cuban people to renounce communism. And another rendition planned to have an actor looking like Jesus washing up on shore as all of this goes down. Now, I'll level with you, the last two renditions are not cited, meaning they could just be some BS that someone came up with, but I refuse to believe that if they were going balls to the wall with the second coming of Christ, they wouldn't go all the way. And that's the video. There were a few other plans I was considering covering here, but the video's long enough as is. These plans included stuff like an attempt to blow Castro up with 90 kilograms of explosives in 2000, gassing his radio station with an LSD-like gas, and dropping Cuban exiles into Cuba just to, snipe them. If you want to learn more, I'm sure you can find articles out there, or read the files like I did. They're really cool. This was a total shift from my old content, I know, not gaming related in the slightest. I straight up just replayed Black Ops 1. I was like, you know what, let's do a Castro video, why not? I hope you enjoyed. If the video does well enough, I might make the shift over to more crazy history stories and stuff. Anyways, thanks for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Remember to tell your mom you love her, or I will. 6 is out.